All right, welcome to 12B on the central nervous system. We left off at the cerebellum, and now we're going to talk about, I'm going to continue from there, talking about two functional brain systems, sort of networks of neurons that work together, but aren't necessarily located in the same region. One of them is the limbic system, and the other is the reticular formation. So the limbic system, I think we talked about this a little bit, is structures that are found on the medial aspects of the cerebral hemispheres, or medial, and the diencephalon. Also the fornix, which is the inferior of the two fiber tracts that link the regions together. It is the emotional or affective brain, right? Recognizes anger or fearful expressions, danger, elicits fear in what's called the amygdaloid body. We also have the cingulate gyrus, which is about expressing emotions and gestures and talking about mental conflict. It's about emotional responses to odor, and it interacts with the prefrontal lobes, allows us to react emotionally to things we consciously understand. So it's conscious awareness of emotionalness or emotional richness in our lives. Talking about sort of those non-qualifiers, right? What is a fearful facial expression, that kind of thing, sort of assessing a situation from an emotional standpoint. So you can see here all of the different structures that make up what's called the limbic system. The different nuclei, the different regions, right? The septum, the fornix connecting the two sides together. So this is quite a big area of the brain, right? That is involved in interpreting our emotions. Notice how there's some in the hypothalamus, then there's the connection on the fornix, and then down here in our lower brain centers, right? Our diencephalon, brainstem kind of area. Then we have what's called the reticular formation. And the reticular formation is interesting because it's going to involve the thalamus predominantly, and it's involved with filtering out unnecessary, repetitive, familiar type things. Filters anything out that the body doesn't believe we need, right? It says there 99% of all stimuli is not related to the conscious brain. And this is the reticular formation. Notice how it's sort of all of the sensory stimuli, and then we have this reticular formation right here. This is the nuclei. So the information comes up, the information comes in, and then we decide. Do we need it? Sure. Do we not need it? Then it just goes away. So it's kind of cool, because again, we can't think about every single piece of information that comes into our brain or that is happening, in and around us. This table 12.1 gives you the functions of the major brain regions. It's kind of a great little summary of what we've already been talking about and what happens in each one of those locations. All right, so let's talk about the protections of the brain, right? We have what's called the meninges, the dura, arachnoid, and pia mater, and their role is to cover and protect the brain of the central nervous system, the blood vessels, the cerebrospinal fluid, right, contain that. And this is what it looks like. The first three layers are going to be the skin, the periosteum, and the bone of the skull. But once we get down here, right, this is the two layers of what's called the dura. The dura mater has a periosteal layer and a meningeal layer, but notice how they are together. So this layer attaches to bone, this layer attaches to the brain. So this dura ensures that the brain itself is held within the skull cavity. It doesn't swoosh around. Then we have this, it's called the arachnoid mater. And you can see it kind of looks spiderwebby. It is where we find the vessels, because there's no blood vessels in the brain itself. It is very similar to the dermis and the epidermis in that the nutrients must travel from the arachnoid mater layer down into. So it makes sense that the cell bodies are here, the nutrients are here, and so this is a very easy passageway from blood vessel to brain. So arachnoid mater. And then this clear layer that follows the brain right on the outside is called the pia mater, right? And that's going to adhere directly to the brain. This is a slide that tells you what each of them do, right? The dura is the strongest of the three. The arachnoid is the middle layer, again, has the blood vessels, has the cerebrospinal fluid, and then the pia mater sort of holds tight to the brain, tiny, tiny blood vessels that extend from the arachnoid mater into the brain. And again, another picture of the same thing. Meningitis, right? This is what meningitis is. It is an inflammation of the meninges. We're going to call the dura, arachnoid, and pia mater the mater, the meninges. And so inflammation of the meninges can lead to encephalitis. The meningitis is usually sort of the meninges of the brain are inflamed for any of a number of different reasons. All right, cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid forms a cushion, right, around the brain. It floats the brain, gives it buoyancy. It's water and ions and some proteins produced by what's called the choroid plexus, the red. And it floats it, it gives it some nourishment, and it is mostly water, right? And again, it just sort of warms, nourishes and floats the brain. This is a picture that you can see all the blue is going to be cerebrospinal fluid. You can see arrows that show how the cerebrospinal fluid makes its way around the brain. The red areas, these guys right here, are called the choroid, right? Choroid plexus, and that's how that's where the cerebrospinal fluid is made, and that's going to sort of jump into the blue area and go around the brain and then up inside the brain, the ventricles. This is what's called the blood-brain barrier, right? So here we have the bloodstream, and here we have the ependymal cells. The ependymal cells have cilia on them, and they are constantly waving and circulating the cerebrospinal fluid. We're getting various substances out, various waste substances in, right? And so this is a really important junction between the blood and the brain. So that blood-brain barrier helps maintain a stable environment for the brain. Certain things can go through, certain things can't go through, right? There's simple diffusion, but then there are these specific transport mechanisms that only allow in certain things and other things are not allowed in. So it's a really interesting barrier that doesn't exist anywhere else in the body. Right, this is a picture of the most capillaries, and then you'll notice brain capillaries. Right, the brain capillaries have astrocytes around them, tight junctions between endothelial cells, right, and you'll see there's not a lot of space in between. All right, now we're going to move on to the second structure of the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord. And the spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum to about L1 or L2. And you'll notice that it doesn't go all the way down. The cord itself would be here, and then it sort of stops here, and then we start branching off into individual nerves. So the spinal cord itself kind of ends right here. It connects the brain with the rest of the body, provides a two-way communication where we have sensory and motor coming from the brain to the body, sensory going from the body up to the brain. Another interesting thing about the spinal cord is that it is a reflex center. So for many of our reflexes, it'll go into the spinal cord and the decision will come back out again without actually going up to the higher brain centers. The spinal cord is protected by the bone of the vertebrae, the same 3 layers of meninges, and cerebrospinal fluid. So it is very similar to the brain in that way. The one thing it doesn't have is an outer layer of gray matter. And the spinal dura is only 1 layer thick. It doesn't attach to the bone the way the periosteal layer of the brain dura mater does. But we have cerebrospinal fluid between the arachnoid and pia maters, etc., etc. As you notice, when you look at the spinal cord, you'll notice that there are nerves that extend in between each vertebrae. So we have cervical, thoracic, and lumbar nerves that originate between the different vertebrae as we go down the spinal cord. 31 pairs of nerves. And then when we get down here, it's called the cauda equina, right? That's sort of where the nerve roots are, and the spinal cord itself no longer truly exists. When we look at the spinal cord, it's almost partially divided in half, sort of a ventral anterior and then a posterior, sort of fissure and sulcus kind of separate the spinal cord into sort of left and right halves. And when you look at the picture, you can see what we're talking about. See these little like involution here. So it's like this side, right? And then this side. It looks like a little butterfly. This is the vertebrae. There's sort of little fat here. Then we have the dura, arachnoid, and pia mater, the white matter, the gray matter, and what's called the central canal. And then the bone of the vertebrae. These are the nerves that are extending out between each vertebrae. And you'll notice almost immediately that this is two roots coming, and then they create what's called the dorsal root ganglia, and then they split again. All right, we'll get into what's happening where. One is sensory and one is motor, one is anterior and one is posterior, which is kind of cool. So again, here we have the white matter, the gray matter, the three layers, the pia, arachnoid, and dura mater. You'll notice the veins and arteries are between these two layers. We have the roots and the dorsal root ganglia and things like that as these pass between the different vertebrae, right? So the gray matter, right? The dorsal horn, the ventral horn, and the lateral horn, right? So here we have the gray matter, right? The dorsal horn, the ventral horn, and the lateral horn. So each of these regions are, remember, the cell bodies of the various CNS neurons. So what do? The dorsal horns, right, most posterior, are somatic and visceral sensory input. The ventral horn, right, somatic motor output. The lateral horn are going to be sympathetic neurons. So we have a sensory input, motor output, and sympathetic, all in that little triangle there. Right, and then we have the roots, the ventral roots, the dorsal roots, the dorsal root ganglia. So the ventral roots are the motor axons that exit the spinal cord, and the dorsal roots are the sensory input. So here we are. So here we have a dorsal root, and here we have a ventral root. So ventral being the anterior, the front side, dorsal being the back side. There are different sensory and motor inputs from each one. The dorsal roots are sensory, the ventral roots are motor output. It's kind of cool. So here we go. So here we have some dorsal roots, some sensory going in. Something's going to be decided. The ventral root, the motor output going out. But they end up meeting up back together here, the sensory and motor. Notice how we have the blue, the green, the yellow, and the red all meeting back up together. Right? The sensory going this way and the motor coming out that way. But when we get here to the dorsal root ganglia, things split from there. They split into this one right here. This is going to be the dorsal region of the body. So this is sensory and motor split. This is back of the body, front of the body, the way the nerves organize themselves. All right, then we have different types of tracts in the body. See these blue and red ascending and descending motor tracts, and so they're sort of like highways, right? It's a major ascending tract: dorsal column, anterolateral column, spinocerebellar column. They all have different roles in the body, right? You don't need to really memorize these, but just kind of know that they exist, and that as we go up and down the spinal cord, we have these major superhighways of different ascending in the blue and descending in the red motor tracts. For example, the dorsal column, right? The dorsal column right here, right? The dorsal column's job is body surface touch and localized vibration. So that's going to be for that entire part of the side of the body, right? The spinothalamic, right? These guys right here. Spinothalamic tracts, this one. Oh, wait. Hey. There's no arrow. These guys right here, right? Oh, I see what happened. This is down and this is up. So the dorsal white columns are here, spinocerebellar tracts are here, and the spinothalamic tracts are down here. So the spinothalamic tracts here are going to be pain, temperature, coarse touch, and then spinocerebellar, the medium ones, these guys, right? These ones are going to be muscle or tendon stretch, right? And so they go along with the cerebellum. So you can take a look at this table 12.3 if you'd like. You can, get an idea of whether they're sensory or motor or what they do. Notice how it's dorsal and lateral and ventral, etc. And see what's connected to where and what kind of different region of the spinal cord influences or, is sensory or motor for each of the regions of the body. All right, so that's the end of chapter 12b. We are going to You're going to move on to chapter 13 next week, and then we'll finish up with chapter 14.